Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Stop LAPD Spying Coalition's Tuesday weekly webinar. Today is webinar number 51. Can't believe we started doing these webinars in lieu of our in-person meetings on March 23rd of last year. So exactly almost like a day to a year, we've been continuing that. And one of the reasons that we do continue this consistency and frequency as well, because we want to maintain the way we were meeting at our home at LA Can and Freedom Room every Tuesday evening. As the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, where people would be able to come in person and join the fight and participate and just move the stuff. My name is Hamid Khan, and I'm with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Just a couple things. Want to go over logistics where most of you may have dialed in and were not able to unmute yourself. And the reason is that not that we want to police anybody, is because we'll open it up for conversations too. Well, we've been Zoom bombed, and we have been Zoom bombed about 3 or 4 times. There are folks out there who will show up periodically. So just trying to preserve the integrity of the space and integrity of the conversation as well. Similarly, chat also is going to host only or the co-hosts, so because we've been Zoom bobbing in through chat as well. And this webinar is being recorded, and these webinars get posted on our website every by Friday or Saturday of each week. So you can watch all the previous 50 webinars at stoplapdspying.org /webinars. So there's a whole series of those webinars. And just real quickly, the way these webinars / working meetings work, because this is not just of course, it's a critical community outreach and education and collective learning process, but it's also a working meeting as well. It's where collectively we build our knowledge, collectively we build our strategy, collectively we build our power as well to abolish and dismantle the white supremacist, settler colonial white police state in the country. So each Tuesday is dedicated to a particular sort of theme. First Tuesday of the week, we talk about the intersection of the national security, police state, and gender and sexuality. Because typically it's seen through either race or privacy and all, but we need to really broaden and challenge ourselves and broaden our scope. That how nuanced is the police state when it comes to very much a state that operates as a cis hetero normative forms. That what does it mean to trans folks? What does it mean to queer folks? What does it mean to femme bodies? What does it mean to sex workers? What does it mean? So how and what are the deep intersections between predictive policing and hotspot policing and spying and everything else? Which is being led by a working group committee as well. The second Tuesday of the week is committed to the war on youth, where we look at the intersection of the police state and how the youth are being impacted, where increasingly we're seeing that how the criminalization of policing of youth is taking on a national security significance with language like violent extremism, with language like radicalization, with language like even like what was recently again the whole idea of domestic terrorists and all of that stuff, and obviously what happened. Just our condolences and reaching out to the families both in Atlanta and also in Colorado as well. So the youth look at all of these. That webinar looks at, and that's a partnership between the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, Palestinian Youth Movement, and some other groups as well. The third Tuesday of the month is when we look at the current political landscape as to what is going on, and kind of engage in those conversations. And the fourth Tuesday, which is today, is on data-driven policing. So with that, I will pass it on to one of my co-hosts, who is also Shakir Rahman and Tiff Guerra. So I'll pass it on to Shakir.
Thanks, Hamid. Yeah, hi, everyone. So this is our data-driven policing work group, our public meeting. So we're going to be mainly kind of hearing from other organizers who are working on these issues, and kind of mapping out our current research, our current organizing, and kind of campaigns that we're developing. So first, we're going to start and talk about what's coming our way with the Olympics, and kind of resistance efforts around that. We're joined by Spike Friedman and others from NOlympics, and so they're going to present for probably around until like 6:45 or 7, and then after that, we're going to transition a little bit to talking about research and analysis that we've been doing around the relationship of policing and surveillance to land and to gentrification and development. That's really building on our fight around that's been going on for many years around data-driven policing that has confronted LAPD's predictive policing program. So we're going to introduce that, talk about the land and policing work, and then from there also transition to kind of a lot of the way that we were drawn to the land and policing work is watching the kind of evolution and reform of data-driven policing. So talking about that process of take over as you're talking, and if others want to share parts of that fight, parts of that history, or even if anyone wants to jump in with questions, the chat is, you can chat any of the hosts, and then or raise your hand, and then we can unmute you if you want to share. So yeah, go for it, Spike.
All right. Yeah, thank you guys so much. I mean, it is a genuine honor, privilege to be here. Stop LAPD spying is just foundational to our understanding of these issues at NOlympics. I have a presentation with me. I'm looking around the room and I'm realizing some of it's a little NOlympics 101 for the crowd that we have. So I'm going to whip through some stuff and get to the good stuff as quickly as possible, because in the last week, there was, for the first time in the history of this Olympic bid, the LA 28 Olympic bid, genuine debate amongst elected officials about it, and it was in the realm of policing. So that is a new thing. There's also a little bit of information around Tokyo that might be novel to people in this room that I definitely still want to hit. And so I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to go through this presentation a little informally, just because of just the sheer amount of NOlympics knowledge in this room. It's almost too much. It's genuinely intimidating for me to say these words all in a row with the likes of Jules Boykoff in the room. So yeah, but yeah, so we are NOlympics LA. We are an organization that started in 2017 out of DSA, Housing and Homelessness Committee, quickly became a coalition of more than 25 groups in the area, including LA CAN, including the LA Tenants Union, including BLMLA, SAGE. I personally organized with Ground Game LA. And then also we've grown to be a transnational organization with groups from Paris, Tokyo, Pyeongchang, Rio, London, and Vancouver. We fundamentally and categorically oppose the prospect of an LA Olympics. We believe a city that is hospitable to the Olympics is inhospitable to the residents of host cities. And we also refuse to measure success in terms of profit. A big piece of this is policing. There is a tendency for mainstream media and Olympic boosters to focus on the question of the Olympic budget, and they define risk primarily in terms of, will the Olympics go over budget, how much public money will be spent on it. We frankly don't care. That's not quite right. We do care to a degree, and we anticipate that the LA 28 games could go over budget by $3 billion in a sort of normal scenario, based on the research of applying the research of Ben Flyberg and Oxford economists to the games. There is an increased familiarity, I think, in LA around what that would mean for the city's budget vis-a-vis the size of LAPD budget and how much that's already taking up. And if something like COVID were to hit, that number looks more like $10 billion. But again, that's not our primary concern, and a big piece of that is policing, because the budgets for the Olympic Games don't include security. The $6.9 billion budget proposed for LA 28 doesn't include the security budget. That starts at $2 billion. It's theoretically federally funded. A big fight that we're having right now as an org is to get a look at the actual contracts for the games. We are not able to do that. We've CPRA'd the controller's office. We've reached out to friendly council members, had them try to get this information. Like, getting the draft contract for the games is nigh impossible, which is in and of itself ludicrous. And I think speaks to why the games are terrible. And we sort of separate into buckets our issues around the games. These are all obviously intersectional and interconnected, but we view the impact of the Olympics through the lens of gentrification and displacement, through the lens of police militarization and increased criminalization of at-risk populations, the diversion of resources and hijacked urban agendas, the erosion of democratic institutions and corruption, and the degradation of the environment. So for us, this is what matters. All right, and I'm going to skip this. If people don't know the name Casey Wasserman, please ping me or Johnny Coleman or Ann at any point, and we will tell you about Casey Wasserman. All right, let's get into it. Because we are looking at a massive militarization process as a result of the games. And a big piece of that is feds give new tech to local police authorities, and that's a legacy that lasts well beyond the games. And we know that here in LA, where in 1984, for the 84 Olympics, LAPD gets the military hardware that includes the tanks that were used in crackdowns like Operation Hammer over the next decade. The sweeps targeting alleged gang members started before the games, continued, I mean, to many degrees, continue to this day in the form of the sorts of gang databases that we are fighting to dismantle. And I think what we anticipate for LA 28 is, rather than tanks, what's coming is an array of high-tech tools, including widespread facial recognition technology, including data capture in ways that have heretofore been impossible for the city to do, that will put vulnerable and over-policed communities at risk and make them unable to freely move through the city. And a big reason that our analysis is that is from our experience in Tokyo. This robot is an Alsoc Reborg X, the robot on the right, and it is the most visible piece of what Tokyo is branding the first AI secured Olympics. It's designed to scan crowds and identify people who are too jittery, whose faces are too red, as these are supposedly signs that someone is about to commit a terrorist act. It can also scan faces and cross-reference them with law enforcement databases. The idea of these was they were already being put in place back in 2019 in Haneda Airport as a test. And then the idea was to disperse them widely through the city as the Olympics began, to take a look at foreign people coming into Japan and be able to monitor them. These don't work at their stated purpose. All they did at Haneda was identify people who were too drunk to get on a plane functionally, because they were looking for red tinted skin, which is just like, I think it highlights and cuts to the core of the degree to which, like, these data-driven policing technologies are both incredibly invasive and incredibly poor at their stated goals, that we obviously know that their stated goals publicly are not the actual goals of these technologies. Alsoc itself. Okay, so Alsoc is Japan's largest private security company. It was founded by the Deputy General Secretary of the Organizing Committee for the 1964 Tokyo Olympic Games, 1 year after the conclusion of those games. And according to the manager of Alsoc's promotion department, Japan's entire security industry was born as a legacy of the 1964 games. There are two primary security companies in Japan, Alsoc and Seicom. Seicom was created to govern and police the 1964 games, and Alsoc emerged, 1 year later. And they are these twin pillars of privatized security in Japan. So this just speaks to both, like, the degree to which the police state expands when the Olympics come, and it never contracts. ALSOC and SACOM continue to be the largest security forces in Japan. They are the heads of the joint task force for the Olympic security for the 2020 games. And they are functionally like Pinkertons or ADT. And in fact, the parent company of SACOM was owned West Tech, which then was acquired by ADT. For those who are familiar with LA's history of privatized security, West Tech used to be one of the biggest players in the game in the 80s and 90s. And the little girl on the left, just to connect all this, ALSOC is a big sponsor of the Olympics. When we were in Japan, they had a booth up where little kids could dress up in ALSOC branded riot gear and take a picture with a cardboard cutout of one of the judo champions from Japan. And then they would get free merch. They get to spin a wheel for free merch. Just to show just like the tendrils and how this comes together. We also had it flagged for us in the wake of our trip to Japan that the government's plan for data capture for the Olympic Games was to capture and permanently record all cellular data transmitted in the country for the duration of the games, the 90-day period before the games, and potentially indefinitely after. And this is something that we found out from an engineer working for one of the big 5 tech companies, that we're used to the idea of metadata being captured and filtered in that way. What Japan was attempting and preparing to do was capture all data, which means image data, video data, call audio data. Like, they were trying to capture all of that and essentially take over large portions of the private data centers that exist within the country for that purpose, for the Olympic Games. And members of LA28 are already touting these technologies here as ways to make LA Olympics run more efficiently. Of course, we ask the question, efficiently for whom? The answer is tourists and wealthy, and that efficiency obviously comes at the cost of freedom for the rest of us. All right, and then so let's hit like the basic numbers. LAPD is talking about a 30% expansion of policing. We got that from a Studio City neighborhood council meeting, where they were like, we anticipate needing 30% more additional full-time sworn officers. The Sheriff's Department also has publicly stated their plans to grow ahead of the Olympics. The Olympics will be designated what is called a National Special Security Event, an NSSE, which means the federal government is responsible for coordinating security, and we'll get into more of that in one sec. And this is not a far-off risk, because this started last week. COPSEC is the California Olympic and Paralympic Public Safety Command, and it was approved at City Council, and it will bring together local and state law enforcement coordinating security for the games, and this starts now. And what is COPSEC, this new thing? We didn't know about this until like a month ago when this hit our desks. And what it is the state basically is setting up a formation of security power that the centerpiece of this chart, and we pulled this chart straight from the LA Olympic bid book. So this is their image. We didn't make this image. The it was 24 at the time, but they made this image to give a sense of what security would look like at the games. And you can see that the idea is that COPSEC, this California Joint Security Command, will be able to be the organization that works with all of these federal forces that come into the picture when the NSSE designation begins a year or two prior to the games. And this also runs through 2029. And you can see that Border and Customs is in there, Homeland Security, the military, they just like drew this out for us, and we're like, this is it. This is what's happening. And I think it's important to talk about, because you can see at the center, there's sort of concentric circles. Who is COPSEC's commander? And the way it got formed, it actually was pulled into effect through state law. And what LA did was join it via memorandum of understanding. And they joined it to have one of the 3 quote unquote seats at the table. The other 2 seats at the table are California's Deputy Director of Homeland Security, but then the other one is LA28's Doug Arnott. And I'd actually be really interested to know what Jules and Max and some of the people who've been following the Olympics think of Doug Arnott, if that's a name that rings a bell for them. But our understanding is he ran operations in Rio, where 2,500 favela residents were killed by the police in the run-up to the game. In the same time period, police helped the city evict more than 77,000 people, violently repress protests, and arrest activists preemptively in the run-up to the 2014 World Cup. Doug also ran ops in London and Beijing, where two of the largest security apparati in the history of the world were installed and remain to this day. And then the third member of COPSEC at the head is LAPD's chief, Michael Moore, who we are all familiar with. And that's, that is what it is. All right. Olympics are particularly harsh on unhoused residents. I bring that up because in Atlanta and Salt Lake City, unhoused residents were arrested and offered to have their records cleared if they took bus tickets to other cities and promised to never come back. Who ran operation at those Olympic Games? Once again, Doug Arnott, who is the co-commander of COPSEC. So like that sort of plan to sanitize or create the so-called quote unquote clean city, to push people in tents out of sight on behalf of tourists and away from stadium areas, that is the work of the person who we are putting in charge of COPSEC, and is someone who the public has no impact over. Like Michael Moore, in theory, we could elect a new mayor and the chief serves at the pleasure of the mayor or whatever. I mean, it's hardly a check, but when it comes to LA 28, that is a private concern, and that is who is in charge. It's also worth highlighting that when we talk about 8502 of the LA Municipal Code banning sleeping in cars, that was passed in the predecessor to that passed in 1982 in the run-up to the games. Let's get back to the data stuff. All right, NSSE's Tier 1 security designation, like the Olympics, Super Bowls fall under this, and so we're using them as a case study. This Tier 1 designation in Minneapolis was again used to displace unhoused people because they were living inside of a security perimeter around the stadium. I think that was it was around a quarter-mile radius, like outside of the stadium and around it, which they subjected everyone entering that area in the run-up to the games to airport-style surveillance, where crossing metal detectors or X-ray machines, or I don't remember the word for what the other type is that sweeps around you. You have changes in restriction to transit, the intensified policing of public spaces. That's the Minneapolis Super Bowl. The same thing happened in San Francisco in 2016, which impacts our understanding of the California Department of Homeland Security, which is the other people at the COPSEC seat of the table. And as we've learned from Stop LAPD Spying, these examples are both not exhaustive to the threats posed to local communities, but that these surveillance tactics are just going to happen, and they're going to put the most vulnerable populations, immigrants, unhoused, and poor people at risk of harm. And we have the Super Bowl next year. So we're going to get hit with our first NSSE in 2022. We have the World Cup, where we are the media hub, in 2026. There are some other Tier 2 potential designated events like MLB All-Star Game. These are just athletic events that are going to hit LA over the next 7 years that are going to create these surveillance zones and opportunities for federal forces to collect data on us all. All right, so summing it up, we need to work together to make sure that LA is inhospitable to the Olympic Games, because a city that is hospitable to the Olympic Games and allows this sort of policing to happen is inhospitable for the working people of that city. There is no good Olympics for over-policed communities, and this has already begun. Like, I'm going to be honest, we are late to the game when it comes to trying to stop this stuff. COPSEC, despite the fact that for the first time, we got real debate, and I think we actually maybe got through to some of our elected officials about why we are not about guardrails, but are about no Olympics. Despite that, still passed 13-2. We still joined it. LAPD is still at the head of this table. And, you know, it's not enough to just have a couple dissenting voices in the long run. That's not going to protect us from this inevitability. There's no Olympics that does not have both more police and more federal incursion. There's no Olympics that does not rely on invasive security tech. There just doesn't exist. So, you know, LA, it shouldn't host the Olympic Games. And I'm interested in getting into more with everybody here around the types of sort of data processing that we anticipate are going to happen around the games, how we can learn from Tokyo as a sort of vision of what was going to happen there and how it can happen here. And also, again, like we've got people on this webinar who have some experience with these past games, and the degree to which they can speak to that and some of the players involved would be really exciting. So yeah, that is a basic overview of where we're at. I can also answer any and all questions on COPSEC. Again, I learned about it a month ago, but have made myself as expert as possible in that period of time. We also don't know if it's meant to be pronounced COPSEC. We just say it that way, and nobody else had said it out loud before, so we're choosing that that's how it's said. All right, great. Yeah.
Word. Yeah. Wow. No, that's a lot. Thanks for breaking that down. Yeah, I've been hearing all these little pieces and seeing it all woven together. And yeah, the way that you're describing it, of that the Olympics are always a kind of a mechanism for kind of supercharging the evolution of policing and investing more resources into it, of course, but also just, yeah, certainly gives the city an opportunity to experiment with kind of these like things that are emerging, and just, you know, collaboration with other agencies, with federal agencies, and in the same way that, yeah, we know that history in the past. Now it's obviously taking these forms of data-driven policing, of high-tech surveillance, and all that. So okay, so maybe yeah, we can. I think it'll be great, since we have so many others in the room who also know a lot about y'all's work and about the resistance historically and currently to the Olympics. If the other NOlympics folks, I see Ann's here, and Johnny, or Jules and Max, if either of you want to jump in, otherwise we can try to open it up to questions, and I have some questions too, and I know Hamid might as well. So yeah, so first, do any of the other folks who have some history and experience with the Olympics organizing want to share?
And I have, we've gone ahead and sort of opened up the unmute, so folks can unmute themselves if they want to. If they have any problem, just raise your hand. I do have somebody who had a question too, but we'll let No Olympics folks go first.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Jules. I'm joining you from Portland. That was really interesting, Spike. Thanks, and thanks everybody for hosting. I had a question. The Doug Arnott thing, I think, is really interesting. And I was like, Doug Arnott, who is that guy? And I remembered he was involved with London. And one of the things about London was they privatized a lot of security. So I guess I have a question for all you LA folks is, how much has it been in the discussion there about the privatization of security? Because it definitely has like myriad downsides, including transparency. I mean, you know, Spike, you're talking about if this person's in charge as like a private entity, it makes it much more difficult to secure documents, like through the, what do you call it? The California Information Act, whatever it's called. So I guess I'm interested in Doug Arnott, whether he's talking, whether all those folks are talking about private stuff. But thanks again, everybody.
Yeah, I think a piece of that is, as we look, you know, there are so many things that we're trying to do when it comes to shrinking the footprint of police surveillance in Los Angeles right now. And the fear is that privatization opens up new avenues for surveillance. Like if you, and it's something that's actually happened in Portland, where there are more restrictions on facial recognition technology that expand just beyond law enforcement, sworn law enforcement. That's the sort of thing we will need to think about as we think about how to constrict these sorts of abuses when it comes to games where you're talking about private security and you're talking about policing working together. And how you prevent loopholes around it is, it's just so much harder. And that's a lot of the work that we are now, because of the Olympics, forced to reckon with as a city. And it's something where we are behind every other city every other major city on the West Coast, I think. And I think a big piece of that is our leadership is beholden to the Olympics that they're bringing to us. And they are scared to make the city inhospitable to the games to a large degree. But that's me editorializing a little bit at the end there.
Just one other thing, I can throw it in the chat. When I heard you say the name, I'm like, I know that's familiar. And I went through some of my papers here on my computer, and he actually gave testimony to the US Congress in 2008. So I can throw the link. I haven't looked over it for many years, but there might be some things in there to take a look at. And the last thing I'll say real quick is just that at the 2012 Olympics in London, they privatized, like I said, and they hired all these people from G4S, like one of the most notorious private security firms. And G4S totally failed, epic fail, flopped on their back, didn't get the people trained. And they literally brought the military in, many people straight from Afghanistan, British troops off the battlefield and into the Olympic zone. So there's just a lot of moving parts that come into play when you try to bring in private security, especially when they do epic fails like that. So I'll throw that in the chat if anybody's interested. Like I say, I haven't even looked over it for years. So.
Yeah, and it's a double bind we're realizing when it comes to private security versus LAPD versus national security, federal forces coming in. They're going to keep throwing Atlanta at us and being like, well, do you want terrorism? Do you want Munich 2.0? And like, of course, the answer to that is no. Of course, nobody wants that. But if that is the inevitable outcome of the games, is that either LAPD grows by 30%, or we hand over our policing to private security that is unaccountable to anyone, or we hand it over to ICE and Border Patrol and the military. And realistically, what we're talking about is an all of the above answer to that. Like, that is the bind that we are being put in by hosting the games in the first place. And like, trying to wriggle out of that without canceling the games is nigh impossible, to be frank. Like, we have that work to do in front of us to a degree, but like, it's why, we're 4 years into a campaign that is still hard no, because like, there is no version of this that doesn't do all of those things, and all of those things impact the most vulnerable communities in our city.
Anna, so you turn your camera on. Were you gonna add something?
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in quickly to say hi now that I can unmute, and then also I am glad I was able to sneak in. I might have to jump off soon, but Spike, amazing presentation. I feel like as we're learning more on a regular basis about what this entails, and so this is, yeah, like Spike was saying, this is all kind of in real time and still a lot of unanswered questions. The only thing I was going to add, and this is less of a new point and just an additional, a data point, is Paris, which got the right to host, 2024 Summer Olympics at the same time that we got 2028. Many of you may have heard about, there were some recent controversial surveillance laws that were being considered, and there was huge backlash. Those were the ones that would have made it illegal to share information about police officers. Our comrades in Paris flagged for us that those were also tied to the Olympics and being tied to the Olympics. And that's something that we also see. Spike mentioned the kind of clean city provision, and typically the things that wind up being covered and additional laws that wind up being extended around the clean city provision. The primary one is visible poverty, right? That contrasts with the clean city, but then the other one is political dissent is the big one. And we've seen in past Olympic cities too, such as Vancouver, under that clean city provision, where protest has been made illegal, or it's, protests of the games themselves. And I think in London, was it? I might be getting mixed up, but like political protest of any kind was outlawed in specific zones, and the penalty was much harsher. We saw too from our trip to Tokyo, we found out a few months ago, or maybe longer than that, my sense of time is a little bit skewed, but that we were on the cover of the Japanese equivalent of the Department of Homeland Security, their annual report on the state of terrorism in Japan, for going to Japan and protesting the Olympics. So we know that the Olympics and these policing, this police expansion and surveillance expansion is also specifically targeted at political activism.
Yeah, I saw Max just turned his video on. I'm just going to add, I just clicked on the document Jules had sent to us from 2008, and in the first, he includes a graphic description of the Atlanta bombing to really, which is going to happen over and over again. Which again, it was white supremacists bombing. It was people who had bombed abortion clinics in the end who did it, and those are not the people who get surveilled. We know that. Like, the surveillance they're going to unleash on us isn't going to stop that. It's going to hurt populations of color in our city. But the other thing that's in here is something I want to flag from 2008. He mentions in here that Beijing just thwarted a terrorist activity in the run up to the games. The 2008 Olympics were the beginning of the oppression of the Muslim population in China to a large degree, and a lot of it was pretense created around quote unquote thwarted terrorist activity in the run up to the games. And we know the impact of that now on those populations. So I just want to flag that you just click on this document and you can see these narratives immediately jump off the page. They are predictable and they are repeated over and over again. This is a playbook being used on our city.
Yeah. Max, did you want to share something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say, so thank you all for this. Thank you for letting me join you. I'm coming from Indianapolis, so it's a little late my time. But, I think that Spike, seeing that COPSEC kind of piece of integration is both, it's you say it's new, but I think we also have to remember that they did the same thing in '84. Right. I'm a historian, so I'm thinking, but they had these kind of joint task forces. So I think that's something we can, that's really important to think about. And the thing about '84 is, that was happening in the lead up to that at the same time that Kappa and others were investigating and bringing the lawsuit against the PDID, right? And there were threats that and there's information sharing potential, right, too, that this is about networks of sharing surveillance. It's not just surveillance, but across those agencies, right? And the Western goals and all that stuff. So I think that's something that we should kind of think through. And obviously I'm thinking through because I know I've been in touch with a number of people in the last week, kind of emailing about writing some of this stuff. So I think that was it. The other thing is, just as a heads up, the one other thing that I think to watch out for, and this is a little bit different than data, is I was just looking through some documents. Spike, I don't know if I ever sent these to you. I found a memorandum of understanding from 1984 about with the Los Angeles Police Protective League's agreement with the city, which allowed for overtime pay, hazard pay, all sorts of other things for police, right? So it's not just but it's the way that then the union was able to expand its positioning using the Olympics as well for those for those moments. So that's just something that I'm kind of thinking through. But again, thank you all for this. Yeah, I'm happy to be, and I mean, obviously more historically oriented, but thank you, Spike.
Yeah, thank you, Max. And yeah, I'm glad you brought out the PDID, which Hamid just shared in the chat. So that's the LAPD's Public Disorder Intelligence Division, which was a kind of a spy unit created in response to the Watts Rebellion that infiltrated community groups, did a lot of political surveillance. And I'm glad you brought that up because I've actually been looking a little bit today at so one thing, in response to that, like you said, there was the lawsuit in LA by Kappa, the Coalition Against Police Abuse, which was a grassroots organization that had been surveilled by the PDID. So that case challenging the PDID was there was kind of a wave of litigation around the country challenging these different kind of red squads and political surveillance units that existed at different police departments. So some of those lawsuits resulted in rules being put in place limiting what police can do with information sharing and monitoring of dissent. And in some of those cities, in particular Memphis now, and most of those rules have either been kind of withered away over time or don't exist as much, but some cities like Memphis, New York also, the cases are still in effect. And in Memphis, we've been seeing that recently, the police have been saying kind of these joint federal task forces that they're part of around jurisdiction over certain, like they're saying, drug crimes or gang crimes, but these like information sharing and these task forces that they need to get rid of the rules on they're trying to challenge the rules on their political surveillance and the limits that exist through those cases, saying this is tying our hands with these task forces. So even here, I mean, just the reverse of that obviously is at the same time that that was developing then, and then some limits were placed on it, police very much recognize that those limits that include their limits on their ability to monitor activists, their ability to infiltrate community groups are directly, a problem for what they plan to do with the Olympics. So, yeah, and then I also wanted to say on the point that on Jules's question about privatization and what you said about that, Spike, is, I mean, from what we're seeing in our work organizing against policing and surveillance, we're going to talk about this more when we talk about the land and policing and the role of relationship of policing to development, is that this kind of privatization is less like a matter of kind of outsourcing of policing to private companies, and more just a way of expanding the power of expanding like the reach and the power of police, as well as allowing kind of other, others to have more influence and particularly kind of wealthy interests and developers. So we see that, of course, through in LA, kind of the experience starting in the 90s with business improvement districts and the, private security forces that they hire, which, became kind of or have been kind of an auxiliary police force that's accountable only to the businesses and landowners really who fund them, but also work really closely with police and are an extension of policing, even if it's not funded by the city. So I think in that same way, it's less like outsourcing of security, more just these are just private kind of militia, private posses that are doing the same white supremacist and capitalist policing that LAPD does. And then also, you talked about these companies that are like the preeminent like private security companies. Now we also have this whole industry of all these companies that are in the business of surveillance, of data analytics, of data integration. That's private, but purchased through the city, purchased by the city through contracts. So, one of the big data-driven policing programs in LA was this thing called Predpol, which was, it's a private company. It was funded though and developed first in close collaboration between some UCLA academics and LAPD. And so but then that became a business that LAPD was purchasing, their services. So were bids. And now is kind of spread around the country. So that's an example of, they do like, I mean, they do like data and predictive analytics work. And yeah, so we managed to kick Predpol out of the city, and we're now looking at some of these other companies that are also key to the kind of data infrastructure, including Palantir and others, and limiting their power, because that's the infrastructure that all this stuff around all this expansion around the Olympics will be based on too. So yeah, okay. Any other, yeah, and opening it up now, of course, if others have questions for Spike and our other guests, if anyone wants to, the mic, you're still able to, people can still unmute their mics if they want to say anything.
Couple comments in chat that came in privately, if you want me to read them. So obviously this one comment is that pre-crime is coming, which, I mean, that whole process has been, yeah, absolutely been very much present as well. And then this thing from this ties into the Great Reset, that when Klaus Schwab said, you'll own nothing and be happy about it. And what he really meant was that we will take all your assets, we will microchip you and mind control you to think everything is okay. Humans can be remotely tortured by the governments via cyber torture as recognized by United Nations. And then there is also a Let's see. I thought there was one more comment. Um, yeah, okay. Nico, you had your hand up, so just want to make sure that you didn't have a question or a comment. You can unmute yourself if you'd like. Okay, probably Nico couldn't hear me. Nico, did you have a question or a comment? Okay. So I have a real quick a question and maybe a comment as well, because I made a note, Spike, that you were speaking that, just as they are the robot that you were showing, which is very interesting, because behavioral surveillance is at the heart of where now what is known as intelligence-led policing over the last 30 years, and data mining along with that started out of England in the Kent Constabulary and is now being used as pervasively all around. So in that, it'll be very interesting because LAPD is actually a part of a national program. And LAPD was one of the first police organizations to incorporate that in 2008, which is called Suspicious Activity Reporting Program. And the companion program is the iWatch See Something, Say Something, which we've seen a whole lot of things. And they even have the standards that even supposedly constitutionally protected activity, such as using video cameras in public, drawing diagrams, walking into infrastructure, asking about hours of operation, and things that you would consider as constitutionally protected are considered suspicious activity, where if you're observed or reported in by a community member, then a whole file is open and it's sent to the fusion centers. So I just wanted to ask you that if you've looked into this with these robots now, and how, I mean, has the claim gone there where the behavioral surveillance and all of that turns into a major sort of a follow-up and more investigation?
I genuinely don't have a great answer for that. Our understanding, though, is essentially some of the anti-terrorism bills that were passed in Japan in the run-up to the games really constrain the rights of the average citizen when it comes to being included in databases like that. So I believe, and again, because of Alstock and SACOM's dual role at the head of this Olympic security force that they have, which is much more privatized even than ours, I don't know the degree to which that information funnels sort of between different sources or things like that. And just so people know, the name of the robot is the Reborg X. And it is created by Alstock. Like they produce it themselves. So like it is like a vertically integrated like nightmarish system. Anyway, so I don't have a great answer overall for like what citizens' rights are relative to these sorts of situations, but I know that they were massively constrained in the run-up to the games due to some of the legal packages that were passed.
Yeah, and one thing on that yeah, I was actually gonna because Anne kind of mentioned criminalization of protesters and targeting and monitoring of dissent and activists, including in y'all's visit to Tokyo and here too. I mean, so the NSEC or whatever the special event thing that you mentioned that that is going to be designated both for the Super Bowl and then for the Olympics. There's actually a law passed, and we've talked about this a little bit, Spike, in 2011 that at the time when it was passed, there was a lot of alarm, basically, because it gives the Secret Service expanded jurisdiction to make arrests like in or near any designated event like this for anyone they're claiming is trying to disrupt or block or just cause trouble, and so that turns that into a federal crime that can be punished up to a year and or more if they say you had a weapon. So that was when that was enacted in 2011, and it was kind of enacted in the wake of the Occupy movement, was seen as, okay, this is I mean, it's very much written to be a playbook for kind of criminalizing dissent and for being able to designate, oh, this is a federally sensitive event or space, building, whatever, and so there's going to be that targeting. I don't think we've seen a lot of examples in that, in at least the application of that. There's a little bit of concern about it being applied in that way around the uprising last summer, especially in places in Portland and other places where the protests were targeting federal buildings. But that's absolutely, a power that's put on the book specifically for these kind of, major sporting events. So it's definitely something for us to keep an eye on. Any more questions from others? I think we have Spike for a couple more minutes.
I have a couple questions. I'm so sorry, Spike. So, just to
Please.
So I think I'm also trying to see that looking into the fusion centers and their role as being central to the information gathering and storing and sharing. And obviously, LA's fusion center, which is in Norwalk, is one of the largest ones. There's about 80 plus. And for folks who don't know, these are like mega spy centers where information is gathered, run by DHS and the FBI and both local and municipal governments, which is very interesting. And I think one of the problems with that, or one of the key problems amongst many others, has been that a report that was published back in 2012 by the Government Accountability Office as well had said that even when they are investigating through joint terrorism task forces any suspicious activity, and if it doesn't, there's no nexus to terrorism or criminal activity, the FBI can still hold that information for 30 years. So a mere act of having a camera, a mere act of any supposedly, so I think that's another piece I just wanted to throw in, and I just have another quick follow up too, and just wanted to see with how we can organize and how we can just build around this.
Yeah, I think the organizing piece is crucial, and I think a big piece of that is time. I think there's a degree to which the Olympics are very able to do a lot of this because it's always too early or too late to constrain them. It's either like, this is all happening in the future, we don't have answers yet, or we have answers, and the answer is, if you don't do this, people are going to die because and so that creates a situation where the organizing needs to be preemptive, and that's difficult. Like, we all know how difficult and how acute some of the current stressors in Los Angeles in particular are when it comes to houselessness, when it comes to rental debt and housing precarity, when it comes to the already pervasive abuses of policing, whether it's the sheriff's department or LAPD. So saying like, hey guys, you need to worry about 7 years from now, it's a difficult sell to a degree, but it's something that we have to do because the work that we will be doing to thwart these acute threats now can and will be undone in the face of these NSSCs. And once it's undone, it doesn't get redone. I think that sort of speaks to these issues you're talking about of like, once the fusion center's got the data, it's got the data. It's not going anywhere. Like, and so creating the conditions to collect that data is the problem, and that's what we need to prevent.
Yeah, and just real quickly, there was a report that one of the U.S. Senate subcommittee had released back in 2012 as well on the role of fusion centers in intelligence gathering, and it was a scathing report. It's maybe posted on our website as well. This is back in the late 2012, that intelligence gathering at fusion centers was useless and duplicative, potential violation of Privacy Act protections, and on and on and on. So the whole issue here being that the issue of false positives and how it can really mess up people's lives. Last quick question about the since we were talking about the robot and all. If you all know that in Tokyo, if they're going to be, because more recently Axon, formerly Taser, which is the largest manufacturer of body cameras and had a sole source contract with the LAPD, has partnered with DJI, which is a major drone manufacturer in China. And DJI is so now they had come together about 3 years ago to engage in being able to do real-time facial recognition as well. And we know that China is already doing that. So I'm just wondering that, given Axon as a US firm, and then obviously we're looking at Tokyo and looking at 2028, that if you all have looked at, or is there any information out there about some of the tactical operations yet, or it's still in the works, or anything that we should be aware of?
It's a great question that, again, if anybody else with us knows the specific answer, like we are very familiar with like the training that was happening in Japan with some Israeli military professionals and like things along those lines. I don't specifically know about the American connections there, but I'm sure I would assume that what you're speaking to is prevalent and invasive and happening. But yeah, I don't specifically have that answer. If anyone else does, please do.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for the opportunity to talk on this and collaborate. Again, the work you're doing is just informing our everything about our analysis of LA. Like without it, we would be at square one and we would not understand just how dangerous all this is. So again, we're so grateful for you to have us here.
Yeah, thanks for stopping by. Yeah, so unless there's any other questions, and we also have a couple others from NOlympics. So yeah, if anyone has any more questions, otherwise we can transition to talking about land and policing and our work on that, which is really related to some of the transformations that Spike's been talking about. Anyone have any questions or thoughts about what we've been talking about the Olympics?
Just a couple comments in the chat box, Shakir.
Cool. Yeah, here I see one that's public. It says, yeah, SoFi Stadium's using facial recognition for 100 acres at Hollywood Park and their privacy policy. Yeah. So so yeah, these examples. I mean, Spike had mentioned that that we're starting to see, the spread of facial recognition not just used by police, but also by all kinds of private entities. And in terms of how we're organizing against that, I mean, I think we have to recognize that that the more that we're just, for one, is that any facial recognition and any surveillance that's happening in private hands can always then be used for criminalization, and obviously especially considering like connections between SoFi Stadium, its developers, and everything around there, those links to LAPD are always going to be there. And then also just more broadly, that as we work to confront facial recognition and seek to ban it, and we've been mobilizing on that in the police commission, and we're kind of strategizing about how to escalate that campaign. We have to take on not just this kind of police use of facial recognition, but also take on the private use, for one, because it's connected to policing, but also just as this technology spreads and as it's being used kind of everywhere and for mundane purposes, like it's being used for exam proctoring, or and universities are using it for like entry into dorms. As it's been used for those kinds of purposes, it gets a lot harder to say that this technology that you see every day shouldn't be used by police. And so the approach we need to take to facial recognition isn't just, trying to limit it or come up with rules or kind of restrictions and accountability and transparency for it, but treat it as really an untouchable kind of weapon, in the same way that we, have approached nuclear weapons and chemical weapons as things that these are not safe in any form. And in the same way that and that no one in society should be wielding them, because they'll always be used for oppression, they'll always be used for policing, they'll always be used for domination. So yeah, we're seeing those surveillance in private hands too. And bringing up SoFi Stadium that way, I think is important, because seeing, as Spike was saying, the whole process and bid for the Olympics has been very much kind of, the architects of that have been these developers, have been the developers of the stadiums, and who own a bunch of property around there, and who have a vision for how they intend to transform LA in their wealthy and largely white image, and that that transformation and those relationships are also what we're seeing kind of in everyday policing, and have been part of policing, and the story of even data-driven policing and surveillance in LA. And so that's kind of what we've been over the last several months, building on our prior work around data-driven policing and the fights against predictive policing, against predpol and laser, as I mentioned earlier, really looking at the kind of role of developers, of capitalism, of the policing of land in that lens as kind of an extension of policing, and kind of, all of those ideologies and institutions work through policing to do what they're trying to do. So on that, so we've been doing, as I said, research and kind of planning, organizing around that. And so we wanted to kind of start sharing that today. That's what this data-driven work group has been working on. And Tiff, if you want to start by sharing some of that history of how this fight originated and the work we've done so far, and then we can dive into more details of that research and that organizing, along with I see Joel is here and others who have been really crucial to that work. So Tiff, do you want to start that?
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Shakir. Hey, folks, this is Tiff, they, them pronouns. And I'm really excited to be on the call today. Thanks, Spike and NOlympics folks for that great information as well. And really excited for this conversation today, in which we are going to be talking, as Shakir was just saying, about our continued work on data-driven policing in LA and what the impact is on communities. For folks who may not be as familiar with this fight and with this campaign that has been going on for numerous years now, what this report, or what we're calling a brief at this point, is kind of building on is this work that was started several years ago, and something that came out of that is a report which folks may be familiar with, that's called Before the Bullet Hits the Body, and that was launched in 2018. And what that was about and how that came together was from folks coming together to talk about and to learn more about how people were being policed under LAPD's predictive policing programs. And these are called Operation Laser and predpol. Operation Laser, that was a person-based and place-based predictive policing program that was launched by, thank you, Shakir, for sharing that. This is a person-based and place-based predictive policing program. It was launched by LAPD in 2011. It was a very secretive program. Folks weren't really aware of it, or it wasn't really being talked about until, I believe, about 2014. Operation Laser was a way that LAPD criminalized people and criminalized entire areas of land. And it would do this supposedly by using crime data. And what LAPD said about Operation Laser was that crime data was being used to designate certain areas, certain neighborhoods as laser zones. And then these areas would then be patrolled, surveilled more aggressively. And people who were in laser zones, who were found to be in laser zones, were considered to be suspicious and possibly criminal. And so this is a way that land and people were criminalized through these programs. And it was very harmful. And also operating that time was predpol. And predpol was a place-based algorithm policing program. And that was launched, I believe, in about 2012 or 2013. And while for both of these programs, LAPD claimed that the purpose was to be using data to focus police resources on locations and people that were most likely to be high crime, associated with high crime, what the community understood through all of this was that all of this kind of talk about it being data-based was just a guise to be able to target Black communities, brown communities, poor communities, all of these communities that historically and presently have been surveilled and are criminalized and are incarcerated and are overly policed, including the Skid Row community, which is one of the most surveilled and policed neighborhoods in the world. And so as we understood all of this about these predicting policing programs, and as we were learning more, what folks in this group did together with folks at LA CAN, grounded in that community of Skid Row, was to get together and talk about what are the things that we want to know about these programs and about these systems. Like, what are the things that we want to find out? And So together, folks did look for more information. We filed PRAs, which are public records requests to find out more information. And I just have to name Jamie Garcia, who I believe is on this call now, who is a coalition member who drove this fight and was just so excellent at kind of pulling folks in to the fight and naming all of these different aspects of the fight and different kind of agents that were complicit in it. And together, you know, we really pushed back on these policing systems and started uncovering what is the harm and talking with folks in the community and sharing information. And then part of that fight was fighting, you know, taking that fight to the police commission and pushing for an audit of these programs so that we could expose what are the specific ways that these programs are doing harm. And part of the fight was publishing that report called Before the Bullet Hits the Body that talks about how these programs harm people and gather information on folks and basically create this environment where folks are criminalized and tracked and stalked. And eventually this can of course lead to folks being, you know, arrested, harmed, or possibly even killed by police or in some other way removed. And that's what the title of the report refers to, is that this is the harm that is created before the bullet hits the body. And so throughout that fight, we did ultimately release the report. We were successful in having the program audited. Operation Laser was shut down. Predpol was shut down in 2020. And also in court, we were successful in having the records of folks who were being targeted through these programs, who were called chronic offenders, being released to the coalition. So those were some of the things that happened in this fight so far. But of course, it's very much still ongoing. Like that, as we all know, this is not a moment in time, it's a continuation of history. And we know that these policing programs just get renamed, kind of transformed, rebranded. So we know that this harm is continuing, and the harm that was done by these programs is still continuing today. So some of the things we're doing now is the coalition is in the process of reaching out to folks who were identified in chronic offender bulletins. And some of the other things that we're doing is coming out in this brief, continuing to examine and consider what was the impact to communities when LAPD uses these types of programs, and examining how they are used by police and then also by the city to essentially control, police, surveil, incarcerate, remove people from land, and what that means for folks. So those are some of the things that we have been examining and talking about, and continuing to research. And yeah, I'm really excited for us to be sharing more about this with folks and to be hearing what folks think. So with that, I will just pass it over to Shakir. I think we're just gonna go into it a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, thanks. So actually, no, I might turn it back to you because there's one more thing that that I think either you or Hamid or also just saw Pancake join. Hey, Pancake. Just to even to talk about a little more the history of you know why we came to this like looking at really wanting to zoom in on the role of land and the role of developers. I know that there's, you know, as part of kind of analyzing the location-based aspects of both laser and predpol, and especially kind of mapping the predpol hotspots and trying to understand how they operated in Skid Row, and kind of seeing through that the role of developers and their kind of how they're producing data and how that data is part of, you know, is used as part of kind of projects that have to do with land, like containment, with banishment and gentrification more broadly. Do you want to kind of just share a little bit of that journey? Because I think that's kind of, you know, that sets up how we got to really planning and doing this research on land and policing.
Yeah, I think I can say a little bit about that. So the reason we are looking at the role of land developers is because it's very much considering the role of police in, as we said, surveilling the land, containing it, making that space inhospitable, somehow moving people off that land. And then also looking at the same time, like while that's going on, what is going on with land developers in the area? How are they moving into the area? How are they seeing this as an opportunity? How are they working with police? How are they complicit? How are they benefiting? And there's different ways that happens. And we understood that when we started researching and learning about Operation Laser, because one of the things that came up was learning about anchor points. And in Operation Laser, what an anchor point is it's a spot within a laser zone. Laser zone is considered as what LAPD would call like a high crime area that they designate on a map as this is a laser zone. It has to be patrolled. And within laser zones, you have anchor points. And these are specific locations, residences, businesses, intersections. It could be any of those that LAPD has said, this is a high crime area. We have to watch it. It's associated with all of these things going on that we don't want happening. And officers would be told to come up with strategies to disrupt what was going on at that location. And what that could mean, and they were just told outright sometimes, is that they could use the CNAP, which is the Citywide Nuisance Abatement Program, which is a program that was actually started under the city attorney's office, and was a way that police and the city attorney and I think 3 other departments as well in LA would kind of collaborate to evict folks from land. And so that was something that was used to move folks out of anchor points and to move folks out of laser zones. So we knew that collaboration was going on. And then another way that land developers or that landlords can sometimes kind of work with police to make an area harder for folks to live in is they can add surveillance, they can add more lighting, they can add more cameras. So again, more ways that they are making folks uncomfortable living in that space. So these are some of the things that we're aware of that landowners collaborate with police to perhaps move folks that they don't want in that space off of their property. And then with this brief, we're kind of continuing to look at, what is that relationship? What are the trends that we're seeing? What is the benefit to landlords by moving these folks out? And just getting kind of a bigger look at that. And then also looking very specifically at where is this happening? Like looking at those relationships between where are these areas where this is going on the most? And as you said, like kind of looking at, because we know like around stadiums, we know that there's a lot of gentrification happening around metro lines. There's a lot of gentrification happening. So also looking at that, those trends as well. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I know all of that kind of started showing up in the research around data-driven policing and those programs and the organizing to dismantle them. And then I've also heard, and maybe I can share just what I know about this, and if anyone, you or Hamid or others who are involved want to add, is part of as the Before the Bullet Hits the Body report was coming out, and y'all were starting to get the kind of the Public Records Act responses about different predpol zones and the geographic aspects of laser, the location based, and started kind of mapping the predpol hotspots and zones, and particularly I know trying to map whether how they were distributed in Skid Row and trying to see if they were connected to the police murder of Charlie Africa, which happened in Skid Row and might have been connected to a predpol zone. As you started doing that, you kind of noticed that whereas you might have expected based on this like typical kind of standard critique of predictive policing, that the problem with it is that it's dirty data in and then dirty data out, that because the inputs are racist, the outputs are going to be racist. And so, and not just racist, but wherever that police were always going to be concentrating, that's where that's where the algorithms are going to drive them to continue policing. But as you mapped it, and I've seen people show the maps, is it's actually, when you visually, you see that around Skid Row, which is both historically and currently one of the most policed parts of the city. If you look at the image here, the Skid Row, right in Skid Row and that area of downtown, there's actually the circles are the predpol hotspots. You don't see any hotspots. Instead, you see a bunch of hotspots kind of forming a perimeter around Skid Row, especially concentrated in the kind of downtown penthousey, lofty type, over to the left there, to the west. And so, the story that kind of you were able to capture through that was about recognizing that actually what the hotspots were doing here was not necessarily just this dirty data in, dirty data out, but a strategy of containment, a strategy of building kind of a wall around Skid Row to contain the community there, and to have this perimeter to prevent the community there from keep them in there, police them from going into other parts of the city. So, and that, obviously, to understand that, you need to have an awareness and analysis of what the role of gentrification and the role of the developers who are invested in that section of downtown is, and kind of both their role in as an input into policing and into data-driven policing, and as someone who's benefiting from it, and also just someone who's that role at the same time that data-driven policing and these predictive systems kind of automate the operation of policing, of capitalist policing, of development. It also hides and Jamie has put it, obfuscates kind of all of those actors and all of those ideologies. So you don't see them because they're kind of hidden under this veneer of data and of course of objectivity. But that's really what's going on. But to really understand that, you have to start kind of mapping out all these connections that you talked about, and including all these programs like CNAP and all of that. So we can get into that a little more. But yeah, first just want to check if there's any responses or questions to what Tiff has shared so far. Okay, well, I can pick up then on what we've been working on with this report, which we've as Tiff said, we've been calling it a brief, but it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and who knows when we'll stop writing it. But basically, kind of as Tiff described, started to see those connections in the organizing and research around data-driven policing, started to see kind of close familiarity or close kind of collaboration between police and real estate developers, and also started to see kind of the role of data-driven policing in the gentrification of South Central LA, of downtown, and started to see kind of at the same time that these predictive policing programs are developing, also the broader story of the foreclosure crisis after the 2008 financial crisis and the recession, and the transformation of property in Los Angeles, and wanted to kind of look at the relationship of policing to that. We started kind of gathering all this research on different aspects of that, and recognizing that we'd been looking at data-driven policing and at policing and surveillance in general, and we've always kind of brought a lens of looking at those practices as kind of as a continuation of segregation, of enslavement, of Jim Crow. That's what surveillance and policing are the modern forms of, but also wanted to kind of make sure that we're also seeing and bringing in an analysis of how policing is a continuation of settler colonialism, how policing is enacting the same kind of banishment, containing, land theft, management, dispossession of land that it always has, and that policing kind of is that policing is an extension of colonization, and that when you want to look at the relationship of, in particular, capitalism and policing, like kind of what connects those two and what drives those two, it's the long kind of many hundreds year story of colonization. So we've been kind of we're working on an analysis that approaches policing in that way, looks at data driven policing and the relationship between land and policing from this perspective of colonization and settler colonialism, but also, you know, dives really deeply and rigorously into the different kind of forms that collaboration between police and developers and, you know, city agencies and the whole kind of apparatus of an architecture of surveillance takes. So at that point, one of our close comrades who's been doing a lot of this research and work on this project is Joel, who's here, Joel Montano. So Joel, if you want to just jump in on sharing, the research that you've been doing on this project related to the recession and kind of the transformation and turnover of South LA.
Sure. Thank you, Shakir and Tiff, for setting that up. So what I wanted to kind of share a little bit here, just in the kind of an aggregate of looking at really the kind of transformation of the neighborhood and understanding of this rise of corporate acquisitions in the neighborhood, especially since the Great Recession. It really kind of stems from a little bit from the research that I had contribute to a report on called Who Profits from Crisis, who really looks at how the Great Recession did set the stage for this massive housing grab and land grab of distressed properties. So I'll share here a little bit of some of the kind of aggregate maps of looking at some of the parcels and areas that kind of will be of focus. Let me share here. Okay. So on this first map, what we also we're looking at, as Tiff had mentioned, really also the relationship with the laser zones and you know, new development, especially with the Crenshaw line. So this is kind of one area of focus that was designated as a laser zone that's on Crenshaw Boulevard, kind of stretching from Slauson Avenue down to a little bit past Florence Avenue. So these are the parcels that are focused in this region. And again, this was of interest because, again, of the ongoing Crenshaw line that's being built there. We know, again, also the proximity to the stadium that's being in Inglewood. And so there's a number of factors here, and then also, again, the laser zone. So what we're looking at is specifically kind of focusing on this more zoomed in view of the residential parcels in the neighborhood, and really trying to understand who owns these parcels and when they actually were acquired. So here, this is kind of just looking at just the residential parcels in this area, which is about over 1,000 residential parcels and a little bit more than 4,500 residential units. So when we looked at the actual breakdown of identifying which are the parcels that are company or corporate owned parcels, here, this second map, you can see what's highlighted in red are these company entities that have acquired these properties. And in total, it's about over 190 of the parcels, but really when looking at the actual units, over 2,100 of these units are owned by company entities. So nearly 50% of the actual housing units in this specific area are owned now today by company entities. And a lot of these company entities, again, arrived post-Great Recession because of the distress that occurred, capitalizing on the foreclosure crisis, and now looking at how to capitalize on the gentrification that's occurring in the area. So again, looking at, say, these 194 parcels, when we looked at when they were acquired, 76% were actually acquired post-Great Recession. You see here, there was, back in 1985, there was kind of this larger corporate complex that was built, but since then it was kind of a small amount per year. But it was really after here, starting in 2010, where we started seeing the spike of the acquisitions of these properties, and this is the dates of purchase that are owned today. And we see a lot of property flipping that's happening, land speculation, and so as kind of our comrades from NOlympics had shared earlier, is really thinking about the 2028. We already see here what transpired after the Great Recession. And we see that there's this ongoing movement of, seeking to cancel rent, cancel mortgages, because it will literally set up another cycle of distressed properties and acquisitions by these same players. So in the report, we we'll be going into kind of a deeper dive into one particular LLC landlord to really kind of show the story of how they arrived 2011, capitalized on the foreclosure crisis, acquiring over 155 foreclosed units, and then starting in 2015, moved the business model to now actually developing. So that's something that, again, in the brief report, it will be kind of going deeper into, but just want to kind of share an overview of what has been found so far. And I'll pass it back to Shakir.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, so watching that whole transformation, and the period of that is obviously the kind of last 10, 15 years, and the transformation in particular to kind of corporate and LLC, which are these limited liability corporations. They're like these legal entities for that usually investors are buying property up through. So, as we started kind of watching this transformation, we also wanted to kind of map the relationships of that to policing and the ways that these developers, this kind of new class of developers or investors, the way the kind of their relationships to LAPD and to data-driven policing and to the surveillance systems that we've been organizing against. And that's kind of what the report focuses on, but I can just kind of share a couple of like examples of programs or mechanisms that happens through, and there are things that we've already mentioned a little bit that Tiff mentioned. So one is we're going to be talking about the role of the citywide nuisance abatement program, which is an initiative that is primarily run by the city attorney, which is the municipal prosecutor. It's currently Mike Fuhrer, who is also running for mayor, is the kind of, I think, the fundraising leader right now for the mayor's office. So his office has this initiative that basically what they do is, even though they're prosecutors and generally prosecutors are operating in criminal law, this unit uses property law to basically pressure landlords by declaring their property as a nuisance or threatening to declare their property as a nuisance. And a nuisance that usually can mean anything, but generally it means, they're saying that, there's a lot of that your property is responsible for or causing or attracting or drawing kind of, criminal activity, like there's a lot of gang activity or drug activity happening there. And because this is just through property law, it doesn't, it's not like they actually need to prosecute any crimes or charge any crimes. They just say, using these kind of civil laws that we think there's criminal activity going on here, and then that's then used to pressure the landlord to evict their tenants or to evict a business that's there, typically because a gentrifying landlord is interested in purchasing that, or is interested in, you know, replacing a business that might have been there for a long time, like a corner store or something, with a gentrifying business. And so, and you know, obviously, and so, and we've seen kind of a lot of connections in landlords kind of really, or developers really influencing and feeding these CNAP prosecutions. And then another way is through the operation of what we talked about before, the business improvement districts, that these are private entities that are organized, a bunch of the landlords and property owners in an area who then deploy their own private security forces, or they work really closely with LAPD as an extension of kind of eyes, ears, boots on the ground for the police. And they also plug into Predpol and other like surveillance and predictive policing programs. So that's kind of, those are the two connections we've been seeing. And then the two of many, and then the report gives into more of them. And then the other thing that the report kind of really focuses on is, you know, just as it's born out of what Tiff was describing of this fight against predictive policing, is watching how in response to the community power that was built in that, the way that LAPD then responds is they kind of, through the language of reform and through a process of reform, and saying, oh, we're actually, you know, just kind of trying to repackage everything they're doing using kind of, you know, concepts and buzzwords and even just notions that are that kind of come out of people who are calling for police reform. And calling for things like community policing. So what we're seeing in that evolution is data-driven policing is now being presented as, and also, you know, operationally being kind of woven into community policing. But before I get into that reform stuff, which is also related to some of what we discussed in the webinar this week, any questions about what Joel shared, or any reflections or questions with what Joel or Tiff shared about kind of these aspects of land and all of that? And Hamid, are people still able to unmute if they want, or? Okay, yeah. So if anything you want to share or ask, feel free to just unmute.
I think one just quick comment, and you know, just and this is obviously the report hopefully will be coming out in 4 to 6 weeks, but maybe just kind of ask Johnny or Anne of what you've heard about this development and the way the predictive policing elements, and as you know, down on Crenshaw line going into the stadium and everything else, any thoughts on that? I don't know, Johnny or Ann, if you're still there.
I'm here.
You want me to go for it?
Oh,
Yeah. Oh yeah, I was gonna actually say the same thing. I had to jump off for a little bit for a rapid response eviction defense situation. So I unfortunately missed a decent amount of Joel's presentation. So I don't, if Johnny, if you have something, jump in, and I would also be happy to sort of, you know, share some of the general thoughts or questions that we've been asking as it relates to policing and, pardon me, policing and gentrification in relation to the stadium. We just actually spent some time discussing that last week. But Johnny, I don't know if you had anything specifically in relation to the presentation.
Not really. Yeah, thank you for that. But I don't really have much to add. I think that you know, we were looking at Wedgwood a little bit on the foreclosure side. And we've been looking at the digital twinning stuff, but not really in any depth of where it's like reporting back on right now. So yeah, that all kind of falls in line with, you know, the layers of things we've seen just in other areas that aren't necessarily even Olympic specific. But yeah, that all kind of scans to us, or at least from where I'm sitting.
Yeah, I think one of the other main things or sort of questions that we've been asking as it relates to SoFi and into stadium development, particularly within Inglewood, is the various kind of like joint jurisdictions of policing, and how those are functioning, right? And particularly then how the Olympics will kind of help facilitate that through things like COPSEC. But then we'd also been hearing like for the opening of SoFi, and we assume this will be the case for, you know, for the Super Bowl, and I'm sure just games in general, discussions of like LAPD being there, and this question of like, if LAPD is, obviously they're being contracted out, but where are those decisions being made, and where are those coming from, and what does it mean for residents of Inglewood, and particularly residents who are being forced out, that there's now this kind of like enclosure of all these different police forces in their community.
Thank you both.
Yeah. Any more thoughts on what we've been talking about gentrification, about developers, and yeah, the relationships, all that, to policing and surveillance? Okay, well then, yeah, then maybe we can transition to talking about, yeah, so the other kind of narrative and focus in this report is really analyzing how reform is a big part of this process by which data-driven policing kind of takes a new shape, and kind of and what it's being used for and how it's being justified today. So the same month that LAPD announced that it was ending the use of predpol, later that month, they put out a kind of a vision document called Data-Informed Community-Focused Policing, which basically lays out their vision for what the next kind of era of surveillance and data-driven policing is going to look like. And just from that title, you can see, you know, the emphasis on community focused, that this is part of this kind of, they're saying, okay, this isn't just a predictive program. That was kind of the whole how it was packaged and sold before, but now this is actually about community policing. And so watching this kind of language of community policing and this mode of policing that, you know, in LA has existed for a long time, and that, you know, it has been operationalized through the Community Safety Partnerships Program, for example, which is began as kind of a pilot program in a couple of HACLA public housing complexes, and actually funded in its initial forms through donations from a large donation from the Ballmer Foundation, owned by Steve Ballmer and his wife, who also owns the Clippers and is developing their new stadium, and as well as, you know, kind of real estate developer, and as well as from Goldman Sachs and a number of others who, you know, are definitely players in the gentrification and the story that Joel is describing of the post-crisis transfer of so much property in South LA to corporate hands. So they, you know, these community policing programs are now kind of talked about as part of what data-driven policing is part of. And community policing, I mean, broadly, it's basically the idea that if we embed police deeply in communities where they are going to be doing kind of, you know, they're involved in, you know, helping walk kids to school, and they're just, you know, they know everybody on the street, and they're kind of helping solve problems and those kinds of things. The idea that that if we do that, then that's going to improve kind of trust in communities, improve trust in police, and just, you know, improve the relationships between policing and communities, which is, you know, what hasn't been there. our report kind of talks about it, and we've been analyzing that the lineage of these programs is they're rooted in kind of counterinsurgency tactics that that were developed throughout the history of U.S. imperialism, that are stretching back, of course, to European colonization of the continent, as well as kind of our imperial campaigns in the Philippines and Vietnam and other places over the years, that's where these counterinsurgency tactics were really developed, and that what is now kind of taken the shape of community policing in the US developed as a way of kind of managing managing kind of trust and consent among occupied populations through largely this kind of infiltration. Surveillance is obviously a lot of what community policing is producing. Also, through another aspect of community policing is like through the delivery of services, including vital services that communities need and otherwise are denied by the state, saying, okay, yeah, we're going to provide these through you, but through the hands of police. So kind of tying necessities and services up in policing. And so those aspects, the monitoring and surveillance through this kind of deep embedding and infiltration of police, the kind of mediating of services, like in a kind of almost like holding communities hostage, saying, yeah, if you want these services for your community, then it's going to have to come through police. And then third is this role of sort of pacifying that there's opposition and hostility to police. There's opposition and hostility to data-driven policing, to predictive policing. So we are now putting this kind of community spin on it, basically to kind of pacify that resistance and to try to channel it into forms such as, oh yeah, well, you should come to this community meeting and you should, participate in these conversations with police and problem solve with us. As that's kind of that's not the form that the criticism is taking. That's not what communities are calling for. But then it's kind of pacified and moved into that. And so that data-informed community-focused policing vision document, whatever, talks about all of these, the role that different community policing programs, as well as kind of highly localized kind of spying infiltration programs, similar to like the fusion centers that Hamid was talking about earlier, are going to be taking. And so we're also in the report analyzing, what is community policing? What do we mean when we talk about it as counterinsurgency? And what is the role that this kind of process of reform is doing in kind of repackaging data-driven policing and trying to pacify opposition to it? So I don't know, Tiff or Hamid, Joel, others who are working on this project, want to share anything more about that?
Well, just maybe a quick example of community policing that has really been now, which resulted in the creation of a special bureau or a bureau and all of that, is the community safety partnerships. People may have heard of this part of this program constantly being lifted as a result. So yeah, and I'm so sorry, Shakir, I forgot if you talked about that or not just now.
Yeah, no, I did a little bit. So that, but that's okay. But so that's being lifted. In fact, so I'm glad you mentioned that aspect, because I didn't touch on that. Is that that's a program that had been kind of piloted and developed over the years, and then the mayor used the uprising basically as kind of a pretext or whatever to announce, and I think it was in July, as he was looking for things to be able to announce as well, doing this in response to what people are saying, announced that community safety partnerships was now going to be established as this bureau, as a full kind of fledged operation across the city. And so, even just watching how that grew, because as I said, it first was privately funded through donations, and in that, and then kind of that helped build out the model and build some consensus behind it that is now used. That's now used to institutionalize it. We've even seen, and we talk about this in the report, that a lot of those donations, like in particular the Ballmer Foundation's donation, specifically said, we're funding this these 3 sites for 3 years or something like that, Then after, on the condition that after that, they have to be funded through the city budget. So, you know, these developers and others who are donating for it basically specified that, okay, yeah, this thing that we're seeding, we want this, you know, we want this to then become a line item that the city has to keep paying for. So that's a big part of how it expanded. And then also using the uprising as okay, yeah, there's insurgency, there's resistance to policing, there's criticism of it. So let's try to pacify that with this proposal, of course.
And the testing ground has been housing projects.
Yeah.
Starting in 2010 with Jordan Downs and Nickerson Garden, and now they've expanded into all 10 or 11 housing projects and moving into other areas as well.
Yeah. Okay, any questions or comments about that aspect, or Tiff, anything to add? Or Jamie, I see your mic's unmuted.
Yeah, I'm sitting in my car getting ready to walk into my house, so I thought I'd jump in because this conversation has been really great, and you know, definitely appreciate it and love hearing you know, talking about all the different components. And you know, one thing I just kind of like dawned on me when I was thinking about you know, the different components of community policing, especially reform, and just kind of thinking about, you know, all the ways that it's kind of bombarding us with this George Floyd Act, the Senate hearing today on gun violence, and the different, you know, reports that the city is releasing right now in regards to the summer rebellion. But, you know, in thinking about, and I really appreciated how, you know, community policing being framed as counterinsurgency, because part of a big piece of this data-informed community-focused policing and this new way that they are basically creating this garrison state, right? Where, you know, thinking about how LAPD will start working with the Olympics, where they're creating mini fusion centers throughout the community. And fusion centers are these huge, you know, the Joint Regional Intelligence Center in Norwalk that exchange massive amounts of like information federally, internationally, and how they are replicating this kind of ability to exchange data, right? So they're creating, and again, under the guise of community, these area ACCICs, right? They just love the alphabet soup, but the Area Crime Community Intelligence Centers, which then are connected to the Community Safety Operations Centers, which the CSOCs, which they call them, are per bureau, and these ACCICs are per area, right? So you're having these fusion centers per area division of LAPD now. So there's 21 of those now throughout LAPD, and then there's another 4 huge CSOCs, and then plus the largest fusion center being right here in Norwalk. So when we talk about what folks were saying from NOlympics about this ability to share information, kind of cross work with different agencies, and setting up that infrastructure under the guise of like this community thing. But like tying it back, you know, to the report, I thought was really interesting because, you know, Joel was speaking about how all this land was accumulated, you know, post 2008. And then I was thinking about these laser zone maps where we were focusing on that one particular case study on Crenshaw. And this is now where the city attorney is agreeing to work with, you know, LAPD and, you know, instituting Operation Laser. And how, you know, at this point, the properties have been taken, right? And so much of the way that capitalists work with police is to protect property, right? And so the citywide nuisance abatement program is essentially about protecting the property, right? The people on the property are the nuisance, are the problems that need to be, you know, discarded, you know, taken away. And so kind of, again, going back to data informed community focused policing, because that's like, it's very detailed. It's very detailed how they're not only developing the infrastructure, but the logic, the carceral logic embedded within it. So they have this other idea called collective efficacy and how LAPD builds with the community. And they essentially say males who own property, who have education, that are not on general relief, have more to like attachment to their community than people who are on relief don't have access to education, or who don't like have not gone through institutions, who are on general relief, because these people kind of come and they go and they don't really have this connection. So you realize like they're literally spelling out that we are connecting to and are going to protect, and just how we found emails of how quickly, you know, a real estate owner can call and get connected to a senior lead officer to come immediately to his property. I mean, let's all go back to Public Enemies was like, you know, 911 is a joke in your town. Like, you can't get help worth shit if you live in South Central, right? And here a real estate owner can just like pick up the phone and get connected to a senior lead officer immediately when he wants to. So really, like, in the end, it's like they are, you know, as we have said, but like now spelling it out, finding the structures that we need to throw the wrenches at, right? Where we need to go to an ACCIC, take it over, expose it, and like demand that it be shut down. That's what's so important about this work that you know, that not only embedded in this report, but like the working groups that are doing that is like really exposing these structures. Because I think, you know, when I think about this housing stuff, one of the most important things that we need to push, like you know, the housing departments and city council, is to stop protecting the property. You need to protect the people. Like, the fuck with the property, you know, like we need to protect people and keep them safe on land, you know, not just the buildings that they occupy. But anyways, like super great, like had my brain going in 20 directions. So like super enjoyed my car ride home. So thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm glad you got home in time to be able to share. Yeah, no, Jamie has, of course, led this and yeah, led and shepherded this work around our fight for a long time. So yeah.
One quick example I can give as to what Jamie was talking about around collective efficacy, and these are the documents that we found during the writing of the Before the Bullet Hits the Body, that they actually had a chart, and they had 17 layers in that chart about who and what. So what level of collective efficacy, basically meaning that the livability and the economic vibrancy and peace and nonviolence and blah blah blah, all of that can be maintained. And of course, Jamie talked about it. The highest standard was you know, a male, middle-aged male figure with a job and education and all of that. But what was very striking was that there's the 17th standard that they had, the lowest, which we considered a very high threat, was that they actually identified that as a single mom, Black woman who's a tenant between the ages of 28 to 34 or something. And it was interesting that, you know, that this is how, just when we talk about racial profiling and institutional racism, this is how the law enforcement agencies come together with developers by even justifying and using this pseudoscience of social science to claim that, you know, these are the threats to housing as well. So yeah, so I would definitely ask folks to check the report out, because it's even after having done this work for so long, you're still like, no shit, these motherfuckers are not gonna stop.
Yeah. And seeing someone else? No. Yeah, and also just seeing last night along those same lines, like communications between the bids and LAPD. That's also very much like Jamie said, they have a direct line, but also just totally kind of dehumanizing of unhoused people who are in the bid, talking about, you know, talking about them as disposable, talking about them as, yeah, maybe they'll die. And that, yeah, that makes me think, I mean, you know, in the way that we're trying to approach this whole report from a lens of colonization and settler colonialism and land theft over time and stolen land is, you know, that kind of surveillance, like when we think about what the role of and historical role of surveillance is, like kind of what you're talking about, Hamid, of kind of sorting and cataloging the population by its worth and deciding who in the eyes of the state matters and who doesn't and who's really part of it. That has always been kind of what, especially colonial surveillance, has always been about. And you know, all around the world, like European colonizers, as they set up and kind of, you know, conquered and then occupied all these places, they were in this business of trying to kind of map out all the relationships, understand, and for the purpose of dominating, controlling, you know, what people's entire kind of social structure and social relationships is, all from a lens of, you know, their white, you know, predominantly male understanding of worth and of hierarchy, and then kind of map that onto different populations. So even that's what the business that police are up to today, even with these kinds of, you know, notions of collective efficacy and this whole ranking. It's all about kind of the gaze of we talk about it in the report as kind of the gaze of imperial surveillance, of colonial surveillance, and that's obviously always going to be a white supremacist gaze, a patriarchal gaze, and all these ideologies are going to be, that's how they kind of operate and are institutionalized through policing. Okay, so we're at 8 and people are dropping off. So yeah, any last thoughts from anyone before we sign off? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, so okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for stopping by and joining, and everyone who shared. Yeah.
Quick announcement that we will be taking a break next Tuesday. So that'll be the first Tuesday in a year because it's a 5th Tuesday. So, you know, just unless if something comes up, so don't, you know, count on it, because something always may come up for the 5th Tuesday. Like, oh, what did you just do it? And I can just see something brewing here. But, you know, to keep it out by that, but we'll, again, the first Tuesday of next month, we'll be back with the gender and sexuality webinar and all. So thank you, Shakir, for letting me make the announcement.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.